Welcome to Church History in an Hour. My name is Pastor Wade Butler, and this is a production of 1517 Legacy, a recapturing of what was because it is what is. The truth never goes away. It may be buried, it may be obscured, but the truth can never go away. Church History in an Hour will seek to give you the family tree of the Christian church so that when you go by churches on your local corners and when you see television programs with people preaching, you will know exactly what part of the Christian family tree they're from. This is helpful information because churches don't exist independently just to be doing so. Churches believe different things. The family feud of the Christian church has been long, and in some ways, and in some times, as you will hear, brutal. Notice how well you will understand how the church came to be and how the different denominations became to be when you listen intently for just a single hour. You are about to listen to Church History in an Hour, 1517 Legacy production. And I am your host, Pastor Wade Butler. This is Wade Butler, Pastor Wade Butler, and you are listening to Church History in an Hour. Without doubt, the church did not begin in the New Testament. The church began in the Garden of Eden with the pronouncement to Satan that God would destroy Satan, although the one who would destroy him would be smitten also. In the Old Testament, there was a church, and that church was a Christian church, based on promise and based on the coming one. But that's not going to be our focus. Our focus today is to explain what happened after Jesus rose from the dead and ascended into heaven. The purpose of this program is to give you the family tree of the Christian church as we know it now in this century today, so that you can untangle the mass of voices, all claiming to be Christian, all claiming to have the truth, all with contradictory and sometimes heretical positions. Now, let's begin with the ascension of Jesus. Before Jesus ascended into heaven, he gave his authority, which had been given to him by the Father. He gave his authority to the apostles and breathed on them, and they received the Holy Spirit. And he commanded them to go and preach the gospel and to baptize and to teach. And he ascended into heaven and disappeared from their sight. Now the apostles immediately began to follow what Jesus commanded them to do. And they began to preach in their local area, right there in Jerusalem. And they were persecuted, and they were very much mistreated, thrown into jail, and were rejected by not only the Jews, but also the Romans who were afraid of Jewish uprisings. But then the little church in Antioch decided to send out missionary Paul and Barnabas, and the church began to grow from there across the Roman world. St. Paul and St. Barnabas were sent out by a little church in Antioch, and they were sent out from Syria to go through Tarsus and all through Asia Minor, which is now Turkey, and then through a miraculous vision over to Greece, and then after that to Rome, and church history says maybe even to Spain. And so the gospel spread like wildfire all over the world. The first 300 years of the church we do not have a record of in the Holy Scriptures. In the Holy Scriptures, the record we have that explains how the gospel was preached and moved across the world is the book of Acts, and all of the letters of Peter and Paul and John and Jude and all the rest that belong back in the book of Acts. You can hear about that in Paul in an Hour. After the death of the apostles, John, according to tradition, being the last, after the death of the apostles, the next generation continued to preach the gospel under severe persecution. For 300 years, the persecution against the Christian church rose and fell, rose and fell. Sometimes the emperors of Rome were more vicious, and sometimes the laws against the Christian religion were more relaxed. But persecution did exist. To be a Christian was dangerous business. You could land in the arena, or you could become a light source for a feast at Nero's palace. So to be a Christian was no easy thing. To be a Christian meant that you had to believe certain things, and that you had to believe them, and that you had to be baptized, and then you were admitted into the holy things, into the Lord's Supper. The generation following the apostles, beginning with Ignatius, one of the earliest of the fathers, set up the churches like this. Each church had a bishop, someone who was leading the congregation, and the congregations in a geographical area. And that bishop had ordained men who would go out and preach in the local areas around that particular geographical area. Antioch was one of them, and also there was a big one in Alexandria and many other places around the world. And these bishops, sometimes under furious persecution, made certain that the gospel was being preached plainly and purely, that salvation comes through Christ alone. In a world of paganism, where people made offerings to Aphrodite, and made offerings in giant feasts and orgies to Dionysus, the god of wine, the Christians were preaching a life of moderation, and a life of righteousness, and a life of depending upon Christ as their righteousness, in order to win salvation and eternal life, not through their own works or deeds or desires, but through the work of Christ alone. Over the 300 years that ensued, the scriptures were collected. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, all the letters that were sent by Paul and Peter and John and Jude and all the others. These letters were circulated among the churches, and they began to be collected into a single form. Over that 300 years, there was quite a bit of controversy. Remember, they did not have the communication that we do. They didn't have the internet. They didn't have telephones. They didn't even have communication in any sort of sophisticated form. And so all over the world, as these documents began to be collected, some people began to interpret the scriptures differently than others. Finally, in 325 AD, or thereabouts, Constantine, who was the emperor of the Roman Empire, made Christianity not only legal, but endorsed it as the religion of the Roman Empire, and called all the bishops together at a place at Nicaea called Nicaea. And he called all the bishops together and all those who were involved in determining Christian doctrine, and said all of this mixture of thought, all of these contradictions, all of these different thoughts about who Jesus is and what Jesus did, all of these different interpretations, I want you to codify the truth. I want you to get together in Nicaea and don't come out until you have the codification of who Jesus is, what he did, and how we receive it. The product of that effort was the Nicene Creed, which was based upon and expanded upon the Apostles' Creed, whose origin is uncertain. But when the Nicene Creed was produced, all the churches in the entire world that were called Christian under these bishops were required to believe the things in the Nicene Creed. There was only one Christian church, and in that one Christian church, under the various bishops, they were required to believe these things. But still there was controversy between one bishop by the name of Arius and another bishop by the name of Athanasius. And both of them had different views on who Jesus is. Arius and his group were very much influenced to believe that Jesus was not really a human being, that he was not really flesh and blood, They did not believe that the infinite God could become a finite person. And so they thought that since the infinite God could not become finite, that Jesus was a phantom, an illusion, an appearance. Athanasius, on the other hand, said that God could do anything, and God, who is infinite, could certainly become finite. And so that controversy, which became very heated, especially in Alexandria, which may even have led to riots and uprisings of all kinds fighting over who Jesus was. Finally, again, the bishops all met together and hammered out what we know today as the Athanasian Creed. The Athanasian Creed states very plainly the doctrine of the Trinity. And the doctrine of the Trinity is very, very important to the Christian church. In fact, in the Athanasian Creed, the bishops made the statement, to be a Christian at all, you must believe these things, or you will be eternally damned. So the Athanasian Creed is not some small thing. It was the standard of doctrine in the Christian church all over the world. Over the next 1,000 years or so, some things happened in the culture of the world that impacted the church immensely. The Roman Empire not only divided, but then it began to decline. And as the Roman Empire began to decline, the hostile forces from outside the empire, which had been conquered so long ago, began to reconquer their own territory. And so the Roman Empire, corrupt from the inside, began to crumble and fall to pieces. The armies were not there. The moral fortitude was not there. The honor was not there. Everything that had made pagan Rome, as great as it was, came unraveled because of debauchery and because of God's holy will. So as the Roman Empire began to collapse, the only solidifying force in the empire was the Christian church. The Christian church had become so powerful, had become so influential, that as the Roman government began to collapse, the Christian bishops and those with the Christian bishops all over the world began to take on functions of the collapsing Roman government. Nowhere was this more true than in the city of Rome. In the city of Rome, the Bishop of Rome, essentially, as the Roman Empire began to collapse and hordes came from the north and from Gaul in order to recapture their territory and to sack Rome and to take back what the Romans had taken from them, the Bishop of Rome became essentially the emperor of the empire, at least in influence and at least in perception of the hordes that were coming and devouring the collapsing Roman Empire. In fact, it was Pope Gregory the Great who stood alone on a road to meet the oncoming hordes coming from the north. They were coming to sack Rome, and that great bishop stood between Rome and those oncoming hordes and turned them back from their desire to destroy and kill everybody in Rome and to sack the place. So obviously the church began to fill the governmental roles of the Roman Empire. But still, what had not changed? The Apostles' Creed had not changed, the Nicene Creed had not changed, and the Athanasian Creed had not changed. Now, as the church became more political, as the church began to pick up the roles of the secular empire of Rome, unfortunately, the bishops began to become, some of them, began to become very corrupt. And as the church progressed during what some call the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages, as the church progressed, taking Europe through these dark periods, including the plague, as the church progressed and society progressed, the church became more and more powerful until it seemed that the church and the state were the same thing. And when the church and the state became the same thing, corruption, of course, followed.